Okay, welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. Today we're looking at Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14, the parable of the wedding banquet. And I am going to start in about 40 seconds or so. And I see that a few of you are on right now. One of the things I'm going to start experimenting with in these studies is answering questions at the end. So if you type a question into the chat window, I'll try to reserve a few minutes at the end where I'll answer some of those questions, and we'll just experiment with this in the today and then in upcoming weeks. Okay, so start. Welcome again to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. We're looking today at Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14, the parable of the wedding banquet. And as I always do, I structure these lessons in three parts under three P's: prayer, perspective, and pieces of scripture. So I'm going to start with prayer, and I'm going to share with you a prayer from my Puritan prayer book, which was a gift given to me a few years ago, filled with prayers from the 17th and 18th centuries. And this is a prayer of love, or a part of a prayer of love. And I am going to read it using the King James English that those old Puritans used. Gracious Lord, thy name is love. In love, receive our prayer. Grace cataracts from heaven and flows forever, and mercy never wearies in bestowing benefits. Grant us unwavering faith, that supplications are never in vain, that if we seem not to obtain our petitions, we shall have larger, richer answers, surpassing all that we ask or think. Amen. Okay, the next P is perspective, and today I want to talk about the ethics of biblical interpretation. And by that I mean, how can we be ethically and morally responsible readers of the Bible? Now, this is a big question, and I'm going to unpack it in a few different ways. So first, there are two things that come to mind when we're talking about the ethics of biblical interpretation. So one way to be an ethical reader of the Bible, an ethical interpreter, is to intentionally challenge those places in Scripture that are morally questionable. And yes, believe it or not, there are places in the Bible that are morally questionable. So, for example, there's a story in 1 Samuel chapter 15 where God actually orders genocide. He orders the complete wiping out of the Amalekite people, men, women, children, and all of their animals. Now, that is a morally questionable and even reprehensible aspect of Scripture. So, one way to be an ethical reader is to intentionally challenge passages like that and say, hang on here, we need to put this in its ancient context. When these sorts of things may have been more acceptable, and not just what's called reinscribe the language for today. Just assume that God still acts that way, or that God ever acted that way. So that's one thing, intentionally challenge those places in Scripture. Another is to intentionally highlight the attributes of God in the Bible that speak about God's mercy and God's compassion and grace, hope, and love. 1 John 4, verses 7 and 8, God is love. So on the one hand, there's critique, and on the other hand, there's visioning or envisioning or highlighting those aspects that are most beautiful in God. Now, there are two ways to do this. Let me unpack this a little bit further. Now, here I'm going to use a book by one of my old advisors at Harvard. Her name is Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, and this is a book, Transforming Vision. And she talks about two ways to be ethically responsible readers of the Bible, and it's developing what I just laid out, both critique and vision. So on the one hand, she talks about critique, and this is what she says. And she's speaking specifically about reading and interpreting the Gospels in the New Testament. So this is what she says. The Gospels require a critical rhetorical analysis, since a mirror reading that repeats the rhetoric of the Gospels without critically examining it cannot but continue to reinscribe Christian identity as anti-Jewish. Here she's speaking specifically about those strands in the New Testament and elsewhere in the Bible that seem to be anti-Jewish or even anti-Semitic, to use more modern language. So what Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza is saying in that quotation is that readers of the Gospels and readers of the New Testament more broadly and readers of the Bible even more broadly always need to have a critical eye and not just take the language in the Bible at face value. The New Testament, in some places, contains some pretty harsh language about the Jews, and so it needs to be contextualized. It can't just be reinscribed, that is, just assumed to be taken at face value. It always needs to be contextualized. So, for example, in the letter to the Philippians, in chapter 3 of Philippians, the Apostle Paul calls his fellow Jews dogs, which was an epithet that was typically used to talk about Gentiles. So this is a slur that he's using. Now, if you don't contextualize what Paul is doing in the letter to the Philippians, it might be easy to then take that language and just assume it applies across the board instead of in that specific context of hyperbole, which is what Paul is being there, hyperbolic. Another example, in John's gospel, John seems to implicate, and he uses the phrase, the Jews in the crucifixion of Jesus. Well, that's different from how Mark, in Mark's gospel, presents culpability. Mark highlights the role of the chief priests, the leaders who see Jesus as a rival in helping to incite Pontius Pilate, the governor, to issue the order of execution against Jesus. So it's the chief priests that are the ones to blame, not the Jews or all the people, as is implied in John's gospel. Here again, if you take John's language at face value without critically evaluating it, it can start down the path toward anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. So when we talk about contextualizing this language, it's helpful to understand the social context of the New Testament and specifically of early Christianity. So many of the New Testament writings emerged in a contentious context of dispute between Jews who followed Jesus and Jews who didn't. So these disputes took many forms and hovered around a variety of different issues. So, for example, one of the disputes was over whether new Gentile converts to Christianity would have to keep the Jewish law. This is actually the dispute that sits beneath the letter to the Galatians, one of Paul's letters. So would Gentile converts need to keep the Jewish law, or could they become part of this family of faith merely by having faith? So that's one area of dispute. Another area of dispute was between the emerging churches and the synagogues, because some of the groups who were affiliated with the synagogues were actually Gentiles who hadn't fully converted to Judaism. They were called God-fearers. So they were participating in synagogue life, but then the early Christians come along and start missionizing that group of people and pulling them away from the synagogue to help form these emerging churches. So now you see tension between synagogues and churches as some groups are being pulled from the synagogues to populate churches. That's another area of dispute. And then, of course, there were disputes over the person and identity of Jesus. Now, many of these disputes would manifest themselves in theological discourse and theological argumentation, but underneath the surface, what's really going on were social conflicts between groups of people. And that's always important to keep in mind, and it's part of a long strand of academic study of religion that goes back to Emil Durkheim. And Durkheim closely linked religious expression with social groups and social grouping and social behavior. So again, even though some of these disputes manifest themselves in theological back and forth, in fact, below the surface, what you find is social conflict. And all of this was happening in the first century during an increasingly tense political environment, in an increasingly tense political environment, as tension between Jews in Roman Palestine were emerging against the Roman army in particular, which ultimately led to the Jewish war in the year 70. So there's political tension in the air, even as there's this social tension between these groups. So, in this complicated social context, in a way, we should expect to see hyperbolic language and the language of invective and dispute in the New Testament. Paul's dogs or John's the Jews. And if we don't understand or grasp this social context and just take John's word for it, for example, that all the Jews are culpable, we would end up promoting anti-Judaism or anti-Semitic interpretations of the Bible. So again, back to Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. What she's saying is that the ethically responsible reader of the New Testament will need to have a critical eye, not just when it comes to identifying those places in the Bible that could move in the direction of anti-Semitism, but also when it comes to how God is presented in the Bible. This takes us back to those genocidal images in 1 Samuel 15. So the ethically responsible reader needs to be critical. And this is part of a broader movement in what's called progressive Christianity, of progressive Christian interpreters and readers saying, hang on a second, we can't just take this at face value. We have to be critical here. And we're taking a step forward into the public square when we make those claims. Because if we don't do that, if we just let the Bible sit there uncritically, then other Christians who might try to interpret the Bible literally will step into the void, and that will be the prevailing discourse in the public square. So it's very important for progressive Christians to be out there saying these sorts of things, saying we need to be more critically responsible readers. Otherwise, a different group of Christians who try to interpret literally is going to fill the vacuum. So if we just accept genocidal or violent images without critique, then, as history testifies, unfortunately, real genocidal violence becomes less unimaginable, and then the Bible can be used to justify it. And the whole history of the taking over of this land in North America from indigenous peoples is an example of the use of genocidal violence justified by the Bible and Christianity. So again, being an ethically responsible interpreter and reader means to be critical. So that's one side, being critical, the critique aspect. But the other side of being an ethically responsible reader is visioning. This is what Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza talks about, visioning. This is the positive side of reading and interpreting. And she uses the language of world making or world creating based on a longing for justice, happiness, life and well-being, and a yearning for a different, more just world and future. So what she says is that we're trying to imagine and then create a world of grace that is different from our present world of injustice and violence, living into, she says, God's intended world as an alternative world of justice and love. So what she says is that religious language, whether it's the language we use in liturgy or part of Christian tradition or any religious tradition, or the language that goes back to our sacred texts, in our case, the Bible, religious language, she says, has a double effect. It can either mirror our violent patriarchal world and legitimate the status quo, or it can articulate God's intended world of justice and love. It can either do the negative or it could do the positive. So we use critique to challenge those aspects of religious discourse, even in the Bible, that fall short of what we believe God envisions for our world. And then we use visioning to constantly imagine and then strive to enact the kind of world that seeks well-being for all. So interestingly, the Bible can be both an ally and an enemy in this work. And so we always have to use it carefully and wisely. There are plenty of places in the Bible that need to be criticized, but then there are lots of other places in the Bible that become allies in this work of visioning. And we should never use the Bible to club or beat or bully other human beings, but rather we should use it as a tool to uplift and also teach compassion. This is giving you a framework about how I use the Bible, always aware of the importance of being critical, critique, but at the same time drawing from the Bible as a well to help live into this grander vision of what's possible for human beings and for creation as a whole. So this brings us to the final P, which is pieces of scripture. And in each one of these lessons, I always go back to some text. And oftentimes it's the text I'm going to be preaching on the following Sunday. So today's piece of scripture is the parable of the wedding banquet, which comes from Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. So I'm going to read it. And then what I want to do is place it in its context in Matthew's gospel, because this is part of a string of parables, 4 of them, in fact, that seem to say some pretty negative and brutal things about God. And I want to use critique and visioning to work with these parables. Okay, so this is the parable of the wedding banquet, Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, so the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen.'" Okay. And once again, I mentioned at the beginning that if you have a question that you want to ask, I'm going to try to experiment with this. Put it in the chat window, and I'll save some time at the end and try to answer some of your questions. Maybe something arises that I didn't get to that you have a question about. Feel free to ask. Okay, so again, this parable is part of a string of parables in this section of Matthew's gospel. And the intention of these parables is to criticize the religious leaders. So Jesus is speaking these parables, and he's speaking it in this context of dispute between himself and fellow religious leaders. So on the one hand, that's the rhetorical purpose of these parables, to criticize these religious leaders. But another aspect of these parables that's more troubling is that each one seems to be talking about God. The question is, are they in fact talking about God? These parables, each one says some disturbing things about landowners and about kings. And if God is even remotely close to being like these landowners and these kings, then God does some pretty violent and even underhanded stuff. So how do we put to use both critique and visioning to reimagine the characters of these parables and then apply them a little bit differently than how they have been applied in Christian history? So placing this particular parable in its context. What I want to do is go back to the first of this string of 4 parables. This is the parable of the unforgiving servant. And I'm going to go through each one and give a brief summary and then talk about how critique can apply. And then at the end, we'll get into some visioning. So the first parable in this string of parables is back in Matthew chapter 18, verses 23 and following. And it's the parable of the unforgiving servant, it's called. So in this parable, the kingdom of heaven is likened to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. So one of his slaves owed him 10,000 talents. It's a huge amount of money. So 1 talent was about equivalent to 15 years' wages for a laborer. So this is an enormous amount he could never repay. Now, obviously, this slave couldn't pay it. So the king actually threatened to sell him and his family into slavery, debt slavery. The man begged for mercy. The king forgave the debt. But then the man, the slave, was merciless towards someone who owed him a much smaller amount, a much smaller sum. And he had that person thrown into debtor's prison. Once the king found out about this, he seized the man whose debt he had forgiven, chastised him, reinstated the debt, had the man tortured until he could pay it. And then at the end of the story, Matthew likens the king to God. Okay, so critique. First of all, this is the only parable of these four that explicitly connects the protagonist with God. So Matthew, speaking through Jesus, says this king is like the Father in heaven. Okay, so an explicit connection between the king and God. So in terms of critique, first of all, the thing that comes to mind for me is that this is a pretty brutal image of God. First of all, God as a king in this story is a slave owner, which is hugely problematic. But then there are other problems in this story. So the logic of mercy in this story doesn't actually follow. So just because the slave was forgiven a huge sum doesn't necessarily mean he has to go out and forgive everyone else who owes debts to him. It would certainly be nice of him to forgive those debts, but that is not an obligation. But it's assumed to be an obligation in the story. The king is enraged that this man didn't forgive those other debts, and he arrests the man and has him tortured until he could pay the amount. And the implication in the story is that he's going to be tortured until he dies because he owed such a huge amount. And also because, who can pay off a debt while they're, tied to the rack or bound up in the Iron Maiden or something like that. So this parable opens the door to all sorts of medieval brutality. If God is like the king and can use these brutal methods, so also can we. So critique, when it comes to a parable like this, involves being aware of these problems, not just taking the language at face value, but actually, interrogating it, criticizing it, and saying, hang on a second, we can't just take this language at face value. Look at the ethical problems this language creates. That's one way to use critique in a parable like that. So that's the first parable in this string of four. The second parable is the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, and this is in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. So here, the kingdom of heaven is likened to a landowner who hired laborers early in the morning and agreed to pay them a day's wage for working in his vineyard. Fair enough. But then a few hours later at 9 in the morning, he goes out again to find more workers, and he agrees to pay them, quote unquote, what was right. A few hours later, he does the same. He does it at noon, and then he gets more workers at 3, and then he gets more workers at 5. Well, when it came time to pay the workers at the end of the day, the landowner paid the ones who entered the vineyard at 5 p.m. first, and he paid them a full day's wage. Well, naturally, the ones who actually worked a full day all the way back from the beginning of the day, they thought they were going to be paid more, and they were outraged when they weren't. And the landowner justifies his behavior by saying, basically, I can do whatever I want. Okay, so now critique. This parable, as with the ones that follow this, does not explicitly link the protagonist of the story with God. It could be implied, but it isn't explicitly connected as it is in the first parable, where the king is likened to the Father, to God. But here, that connection is not explicit. So some people have assumed that the landowner is God. Again, even though Matthew never actually explicitly says this. But if we take that as the right connection, that the landowner is likened to God, we again have a brutal image of God here. First of all, the landowner is duplicitous in this story. He agrees to pay a day's wage to the first group of workers, but he says to the other workers, I'll pay whatever is right. Literally, I'll pay whatever is just. But he never actually says what he's going to pay them. And by the end of the story, we realize that the payment scale was not, in fact, just. Workers weren't paid for a full day of work. They were paid for much, much less, even though they were paid the same amount as those who worked a full day. Then the question is, why does Matthew call it a lesson in justice when it really seems to be a lesson in mercy, giving undeserved favor to people who didn't work for it? Why is it called justice? It doesn't actually make sense. There are also economic problems in this story. So landowners in the ancient world could be terribly oppressive. They held all the economic cards, they could exploit their workers. And given that Jesus's earliest followers were peasants, and most likely the kinds of people who could be exploited in this way, would any of them listening to this parable have been inclined to see God as the landowner and thus as the oppressor? Probably not. But again, critique here involves critically evaluating the language of a story like this, especially when it's presenting God in a less than positive light. Here, God is likened to an oppressive landowner. Okay, that's the second parable. The third parable in this string of parables is the parable of the wicked tenants, and it's in Matthew chapter 21, starting in verse 33. And we looked at this story last week. So in this story, another landowner, this time he plants a vineyard and hires tenant farmers to work it. At harvest time, he sends a delegation of slaves to collect his produce. Now, there's no mention in the story of how much produce they're supposed to be collecting. It could be implied that he's going to collect all of the produce and not just a portion of it. So one of the things that I mentioned both in my sermon on Sunday and also in the study last Thursday is that we have various lease agreements from the ancient world that have been preserved on papyrus paper. And one of those lease agreements dates to 88 CE in the first century. And in that lease agreement, two prospective tenant farmers, they petitioned three brothers who own a vineyard. They petitioned them to create a lease agreement so that these two tenant farmers could now work the vineyard. And the agreement was that the tenant farmers would pay 2/3 of the produce to the brothers who owned it, and they would keep 1/3 for themselves, while also taking on the full burden of working the vineyard. Now, presumably, they fulfilled their promise. But we're not told a whole lot of those kinds of details in this parable. And again, the implication could be that this landowner sent a delegation to the tenants to collect all the produce and leave them sort of high and dry. So if we read it that way, then of course the tenants object and kill the members of this first delegation, while the landowner sends another delegation to collect produce, and the tenants do the same to them. And then finally, the landowner sends his son. His son is also attacked and killed by the tenants. So then the landowner escalates this cycle of violence, and then he comes himself with a group of presumably mercenaries to wipe out the tenants, take back the vineyard, and then lease it to other tenants. So now critique. Again, the connection between the landowner and God is not explicit in this story. It could be implied, and some in Christian history have indeed made that connection. So, assuming, for the sake of argument, that the landowner is God, we again have a brutal image of God. God is a slave owner in this story. God is a landowner in this story. And we saw the problems with economic problems with landowners in the previous parable. And if that landowner is trying to squeeze his tenants by taking all the produce, then he's not just, a slaveholder and a landowner, he's also unjust. It's unfair. Now, use of this parable in particular in Christian history, going all the way back to the 4th century in the writings of the church historian Eusebius, all the way back to then, those interpretations have tended to move in the direction of anti-Semitism. So, one of the prevailing interpretations in Christian history of this parable has been that these wicked tenants are the Jewish people. And the Jewish people in the story kill the son of the landowner. Well, this has exposed Jews throughout Christian history to the epithet Christ killers. And then the new tenants, the ones who are now going to inherit the vineyard, are the Christians, right? So the Jewish people get the vineyard taken away from them because they killed the son, and now that vineyard is being given to new tenants, the Christians. And of course, because the story portrays the landowner as escalating the violence, then it becomes possible in Christian history to do actual violence to the Jews, and indeed, that did happen. So critique in this case involves not just criticizing the language of the parable and the insinuation that the landowner is God, but also criticizing the history of interpretation in Christian history that has drifted into anti-Semitism. Okay, that brings us to the final parable in this string of four. And this is today's parable, the parable of the wedding banquet, Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. And here, the kingdom of heaven is likened to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to personally reach out to those who'd been invited to the party. Those who were invited wouldn't come. They made all sorts of excuses about needing to work farms, needing to work businesses, and some of them even attacked this delegation of slaves and killed them. The king in the story is enraged at this. He sends troops to destroy those people and to burn their city to the ground. The slaves are then sent out again into the streets to invite everyone. All the people are now invited to the party. And then in the party, the king sees a man who didn't have on any wedding clothes. And he has the man arrested, bound hand and foot, tossed into outer darkness, which is a sort of hellish prison. And indeed, in Christian history, the outer darkness where there's weeping of gnashing of teeth has been interpreted as hell. So now the critique. Again, Matthew doesn't connect the king to God here. It's a connection that could be implied. So, if the king is likened to God, then yet again, we have God as portrayed as a slave owner and also portrayed violently and as a brutal individual in the story. This king is insulted by the excuses that the invited guests have made for not coming to the party, and he responds violently. Then the question becomes, why would the king send troops to the city of the people, who were invited to this party, and then destroy the city entirely, just because they wouldn't come to the feast? Seems excessive. And then why was it a problem for this man to show up without wedding clothes? According to how the parable unfolds, these slaves are sent out a final time into all the highways to pull in everybody. And then this poor dude, he's there without a tuxedo on, and he gets, imprisoned for it. Did everyone else who showed up from the streets have, tuxedos and dresses on? It doesn't really make any sense. So there are lots of problems with these stories, particularly when you link the protagonists of the stories to God. In the first story, the king has a man tortured until he pays his debt. In the second, a duplicitous landowner doesn't pay a just wage. In the third, a possibly greedy and certainly violent landowner wipes out tenant farmers. And in the fourth, the king violently wipes out an entire city because a few of its inhabitants won't come to his party. And then he locks in prison a dude who came to the party in the wrong outfit. Now, if we view the kings and landowners in these stories as God, then we have a pretty monstrous image of God, greedy and violent and duplicitous, vindictive, and even unjust. God sounds an awful lot like what a king or a landowner might have been like in the ancient world, and doesn't sound a whole lot like the God as portrayed in so many other places in the Bible as abounding in steadfast love and mercy, unending love. So, we have some tension here that we're trying to work through. So let me try to explain in the final few minutes what I think is going on. And just to return to something I mentioned a couple times already, if you do have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat window. I'm going to save a few minutes at the end to answer questions. And if you don't, that's totally fine. Okay, so let me try to explain what I think is going on here with these parables. So first of all, Matthew, as a gospel writer, has an agenda. So one scholar, New Testament scholar, his name is Anthony Saldarini, he made the argument, and it's pretty compelling, that the Gospel of Matthew is part of a Jewish milieu in the last part of the first century. And it's part of a group of Jewish texts that emerged in the wake of the destruction of the temple in the year 70 by the Roman army. This was during the Jewish war with Rome. It led to the toppling of the temple and the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. Well, Matthew, so says Saldarini, is part of a group of Jewish texts trying to make sense of this catastrophic event. And one of the things that Matthew is trying to do is similar to what some of these other Jewish texts are trying to do, which is to place blame. Who is to blame for this catastrophic event of the destruction of the temple, the very seat, the centerpiece of Jewish religion up to that point? So Matthew blames the chief priests and Pharisees, the religious leaders. They're the ones to blame for this catastrophic event. Other Jewish writers, like, for example, the first century Jewish historian Josephus, he blames the revolutionaries. So these are the people who were in charge of the Jewish army, and they were the ones who resisted surrendering to the Romans, even though the Roman army had surrounded the city of Jerusalem. They wanted to fight right to the death. And so Josephus blames those revolutionaries. You guys should have submitted. You guys should have surrendered. If you had done that, we would have preserved our city. And because you didn't, we weren't able to. So it's the blame game in the last part of the first century. So Anthony Saldarini argues that the Gospel of Matthew is participating in this discourse. So Matthew's audience, his first audience, the readers or first hearers of this gospel, most likely they were ethnic Jews who happened to be followers of Jesus, and they were in dispute with some of their fellow Jews. All of them were trying to make sense of what had happened in their city. So in the heat of the rhetorical moment, this may have led to hyperbolic language in the parables. Hyperbolic language about his fellow Jews, Matthew's fellow Jews, and hyperbolic language even when it comes to how God is portrayed. Because one of the incentives for Matthew would be to portray God in such a way as God is on our side. And we're saying that God is on our side, and God is the one who is enacting punishment against those who are to blame for this catastrophic event. Now, that leads to another explanation of what I think is going on here, which is Matthew is part of biblical writers more broadly who are writing thousands of years ago, and even, in some cases with early biblical traditions, 4,000 years ago. But they're writing in the ancient world in a particular context that we might refer to as a context of primitive theology. Now, primitive is not the best word to use because of its colonialist and racist undertones, but it does help to describe a little bit the kinds of theological pictures that sometimes we find in the Bible. And in these parables, I think we're seeing this at work. We're seeing a kind of primitive theology that very much reflects the larger cultural and rhetorical context of the ancient world, how the gods were portrayed. So one example, in Homer's Iliad, the first part of the Iliad portrays the god Apollo hurling a pestilence upon the Achaean army on the beach of Troy. Most people today wouldn't say that the Trojan War, the outcome of the Trojan War, was affected by the god Apollo. But in the ancient world, this is part of how one understood the relationship between gods and humans. Another example of this, you take an inscription from the city of Philadelphia that dates to about 100 BCE. It's an inscription from a household religion in the house of a man named Dionysius. The inscription is a rock, and on that rock is this inscription that lists all the rules of the group that was meeting in Dionysius's house. These are religious rules. And when the folks gathered in his house, one of their rituals was to touch this rock. And by touching the rock, they were exposing themselves to the eyes of the gods, because what they were saying publicly is that I am attesting that I have kept all of these rules, even though I haven't been in this house since the last time we gathered. But then that inscription ends with saying, if you lie when you touch this rock, beware of the gods, because they will be merciless toward you. So again, in the ancient world, this is part of the understanding of how gods interacted with humans. And there are, of course, many places in the Bible itself where God is portrayed in a similar guise, as being very interactive and even brutal with human beings. So to liken God to the landowners or to the kings in these parables, and to weave in notions of violence and duplicity, is not necessarily surprising when we place these parables in a much larger rhetorical context of the ancient world, a world of what we might refer to as primitive theology. But this brings us back to where I started, which is the ethics of interpretation, the ethics of critique, and also visioning. So if Matthew has an agenda, and if Matthew's gospel reflects an earlier or even primitive theology, a theology that could justify violence and even anti Semitism, then how might we be ethically responsible readers of Matthew? We can't just uncritically accept his language at face value. It's language that seems to create a disturbing and even unethical picture of God. So we use critique to challenge those aspects of religious discourse, even discourse in the Bible, that falls short of those other presentations in the Bible that depict God as gracious and merciful, abounding in steadfast love. We use critique to critique those negative sides, those negative portrayals, in order to emphasize these more positive ones. Um, and then we use visioning to constantly imagine and then strive to enact the kind of world that seeks the well being of all. And that will necessarily mean downplaying and criticizing those aspects of God that really are negative in the Bible. So, again, the Bible comes across as both an enemy and an ally in this work of being ethically responsible. So we have to use it carefully and wisely. It should never be, again, a club to beat and bully, but rather a tool to uplift and teach compassion. And I actually think when we engage in this kind of critique and visioning, that we actually grow more closely in line with the mind of Christ and the example of Christ, who really did embody a kind of God that's not like the landowners or the kings in these stories. And then by engaging in this process of being ethically responsible, both critique and vision, I think we actually become better disciples and even better human beings. So I'm going to save just a couple of minutes here. And I got one question. Does the third story relate to the current political situation in Israel? So the third story is the one I think you're referring to, the one that I preached on this past Sunday. And one of the things that I did with that story is to not connect the landowner to God. Instead, I focused on the cycle of violence in that parable. So, yes, the tenants are wicked in the sense that they're engaged in escalating violence. But the landowner is also culpable in that story. He also contributes to this cycle of violence by coming himself with these violent mercenaries and wiping out the tenants. So one of the points that I made was this cycle of violence, in referring to a phrase that Gandhi used, which is an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Everyone is blind at the end of that parable. The landowner has lost his son, his sole heir, so he's blind. But of course, the tenants are all dead, so they're blind too, quote unquote. So this is just a tragic parable. It's a tragedy unfolding about the negative side of a cycle of violence. So in that sense, of course, the parable can be applied to all kinds of situations where you see cycles of violence that seem unending and really at the end of the day pointless because they leave everyone blind. That's a great question. Any others? Okay, I will see you next week.